They dragged me out of my own bed like I was some intruder in the very house I paid for with 40 years of work. That is the sentence I would repeat in my head over and over again as I lay on the floor that night, staring up at the cracked ceiling, clutching the thin quilt they tossed at me like a scrap to a dog. When people talk about growing old with dignity, they never tell you that sometimes your own blood can strip that dignity away piece by piece until you barely recognize yourself in the mirror. I never thought I would see the day when my son and his wife would stand over me, their voices sharp, their eyes hard, and tell me that my place was no longer in the bed where I once lay beside my husband, the man who built this home, brick by brick, with his own 2 hands. But that night, it happened, and the humiliation was so heavy, it felt like a second body pressed against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. The bed they forced me from wasn't just a mattress and a frame. It was the symbol of my life's work. I bought that bed with overtime wages from the hospital, where I scrubbed floors and changed sheets for people who never even learned my name. I slept in it after 12-hour shifts, when my feet burned so badly I cried, while soaking them in a bucket of hot water with Epsom salt. That bed was where I brought my baby home, swaddled in the same quilt my mother sewed for me before she passed. And yet, after all of that history, after all those sacrifices, my son and his wife stood at the doorway and ordered me to move. Their excuse was that they were tired, that they needed comfort, that I was being selfish to keep the best room in the house while they had to squeeze into the smaller one. They said it with straight faces, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to evict a woman from her own bed. I wanted to fight back in that moment. But there is a strange paralysis that comes with betrayal from those closest to you. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, only a dry rasp of breath. My son, my only son, looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and something even colder, like contempt. I raised him on prayers and cornbread, working double shifts so he could go to school with polished shoes and fresh notebooks. I used to sit at the kitchen table long after midnight, cutting coupons so I could stretch my paycheck far enough to keep him fed. And this was the man who now told me to get on the floor. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed, smirking like this was a victory she had been waiting for. I gathered my pillow, my blanket, and moved slowly, my knees stiff and aching, until I lowered myself onto the hardwood. Every bone in my body protested, and the cold from the floor seeped into my joints like ice water. They shut the door after themselves without another word, and I lay there in the dark, listening to their laughter from the other side, laughter muffled by the wall but sharp enough to slice through me. That sound will stay with me until the day I die. It was the sound of people who believed they had won, who believed I had no fight left in me. The night stretched on endlessly. Every creak of the house reminded me of my husband, gone these 12 years, who used to get up at 3 a.m. to start his shift at the factory. He would kiss me on the forehead and whisper that he was working for our future, for the security of the family, for the roof over our heads. He was buried with calloused hands and a crooked back, but he never once complained. If he could see what his son had become, I don't know if his heart would break or if he would rise from the grave out of sheer fury. I tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. My body ached too much. My mind spun with memories and questions. How did it come to this? Was there a moment I missed? A warning sign that my son was drifting away from the values I raised him with? I remembered the time he was 10 years old and got into a fight at school. The principal called me in, furious, and I stood there, embarrassed, as he explained how my boy had pushed another child on the playground. When I asked him why, he said it was because the boy called him poor. I knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and told him that poor was nothing to be ashamed of, but cruelty was. I thought he had understood me then. I thought I had planted seeds of empathy. But somewhere along the line, that lesson withered. I whispered a prayer as I lay there, not just for myself, but for him too, because I knew anyone who could do this to his own mother had lost something essential in his soul. I asked God for strength, because I didn't know how much longer I could carry this burden. My back screamed with every breath, and yet a small fire began to burn inside me. I realized that the humiliation they forced on me that night would not end here if I let it go unanswered. People like them, people who feed on control, only stop when someone stronger stands up. The hours dragged on. At some point I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of the morning birds outside my window and the faint smell of coffee. My son and his wife were already moving about the kitchen, talking in low voices. I pushed myself up from the floor, my palms pressing against the boards, my wrists shaking. Every muscle ached, but I forced myself to stand tall. The quilt slid from my shoulders to the ground, and I left it there, a silent testimony of the night's cruelty. I shuffled toward the kitchen, my eyes stinging but dry, because I had already cried enough in the darkness. When I stepped into the doorway, they looked at me as though I were a nuisance, as though my very presence spoiled their morning. They didn't apologize. They didn't even look guilty. That was when I knew something had to give, and it wouldn't be me this time. The morning after that long and humiliating night began with a kind of silence that felt heavier than noise, the kind that presses against your chest and makes you aware of every heartbeat. I moved slowly through the house, my back stiff from the floor and my legs weak from lack of sleep, but I refused to show it. Pride is sometimes the only shield left to a woman who has been stripped of everything else. The kitchen smelled of bacon grease and burnt toast, though I knew none of it was prepared with me in mind. My son sat at the table in a t-shirt, scrolling through his phone as if the world beyond that glowing screen mattered more than the living, breathing woman who had carried him into this life. His wife leaned against the counter, sipping coffee, her hair perfectly styled, her smile smug, as though she had just won some invisible battle. Neither of them acknowledged me when I entered. It was as if I were a shadow in my own home, a silent figure who existed only to serve and not to be seen. I poured myself a glass of water, each movement deliberate, careful, because I knew if I let them see my hands tremble, they would think it was weakness. I sat at the far end of the table, opposite my son, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine another version of this morning, one where we were a family sharing breakfast, one where laughter filled the kitchen and love was stronger than resentment. But that version had been stolen from me, and all that remained was this theatre of cold indifference. They began speaking in hushed voices, but I could still hear the edges of their words. Money, bills, a plan to sell something, and then my name slipped between them like a blade. I knew in that moment that they weren't just after my bed. They were after my whole life, the savings I had scraped together, the house I had worked so hard to keep. My body tightened, and though I stayed silent, my heart pounded so loudly I feared they might hear it. It was then, while I sat gripping the edge of the table to steady myself, that the knock came at the door. At first, they ignored it, assuming it was a delivery or some neighbour come to bother them. But the knock came again, firmer, followed by a voice, official and unmistakable. Sheriff's Department. My son stiffened, his eyes darting toward his wife, whose face paled for just a moment before she pasted on a smile that looked more like a grimace. They weren't expecting this, and neither was I. My heart skipped, then raced, because when the law shows up at your door, Everything you have kept hidden is suddenly threatened with light. I rose before they could stop me, my feet carrying me down the hallway with more strength than I knew I had. Opening the door felt like opening a window after years of stale air, letting in something sharp and honest. The sheriff stood tall, hat in hand, his face serious but not unkind. Behind him was my neighbour, Miss Clarice, who must have been the one to call. She stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set, the look of a woman who had seen enough and decided silence was no longer an option. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, tipping his hat slightly in respect. "We received a call of possible elder mistreatment. Mind if I come in?" For a moment I hesitated, not because I didn't want him there, but because I felt the old shame creeping in, the shame of admitting to a stranger that your own family has turned against you. My son appeared at my side quickly, his voice too sweet, his tone rehearsed. "There's no need for that, officer." My mother gets confused sometimes. She must have said something to the neighbour that sounded worse than it was. The sheriff's eyes moved between us, measuring, weighing. "Even so," he said evenly, "I need to come inside and make sure everything is all right." His presence filled the room, cutting through the false cheer of my son and the defensive silence of his wife. I stepped back and gestured for him to enter, my voice steadier than I felt. "Please," I said. "Come in. You'll see for yourself." As he stepped inside, I noticed how my son's jaw clenched, how his wife's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. The sheriff's gaze travelled around the house, resting briefly on the rumpled quilt still lying on the floor where I had spent the night. It sat there like an unspoken witness, mute but undeniable. He picked it up between two fingers, glanced at me, then at them. "Whose is this?" he asked simply. My son laughed nervously, the sound hollow. "Oh, that's just Mom's choice. She likes to, sometimes sleep in the living room, says it helps her back." He looked at me as he said it, daring me to contradict him, as though fear would hold me still. But something inside me broke free in that moment, some deep reservoir of courage I didn't know I still had. I looked straight at the sheriff, my voice clear and unwavering. "They put me on the floor last night. They dragged me out of my bed." The words hung in the air like thunder, and though my son immediately began protesting, talking over me, insisting I was exaggerating, I saw the sheriff's expression harden. He turned to Miss Clarice, who spoke with quiet authority. "I heard them. I heard the yelling. And I saw her this morning, stiff, sore, looking like she had slept on the ground." Her testimony was like a nail sealing the truth. The sheriff asked a few more questions, his notebook coming out, his pen scratching steadily. Each answer from me was measured, each denial from them sharper, more frantic. The power in the room had shifted, and they felt it slipping away. I could see it in their restless movements, their unwillingness to meet his eyes. For once, I was not the one shrinking under the weight of judgment. They were. When the sheriff finally closed his notebook, his voice was firm, decisive. "We're going to have to look deeper into this. Until then, I suggest everyone remain calm. But know this: if I find evidence of neglect or abuse, there will be consequences." His words cut through the kitchen like a blade, sharp and final. My son tried to argue, but the sheriff raised a hand, silencing him with the authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. As he turned to leave, he looked at me once more, and in that look I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Validation. Someone believed me. Someone saw me. Miss Clarice gave my hand a quick squeeze before following him out, and I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sudden, overwhelming relief of no longer being invisible. Behind me, my son muttered under his breath, his wife pacing like a trapped animal. I knew the battle was far from over, but the catalyst had been set in motion. The sheriff had walked through my door, had seen enough to raise questions, and now the truth would no longer remain buried under their lies. The ground beneath them had shifted, and though they didn't realize it yet, that knock on the door was the beginning of the end of their reign in my home. When the door shut behind the sheriff and Miss Clarice, the air inside my house changed in a way that felt almost physical, as if the pressure dropped and a storm rushed in to take advantage of it. And for a long breath, none of us moved, each of us, waiting for the other to make the first mistake. My son was the one to break the silence, laughing in that high, brittle way he does when he's cornered, telling me I had embarrassed us all, that neighbours would talk, that law enforcement would flag our address, as if all of this were some administrative inconvenience and not the truth laid bare in morning light. His wife didn't laugh. She set her mug down with care, wiped the ring of coffee from the counter, and asked very softly for my phone, saying the sheriff might call back, and she didn't want me to get confused and say something to make things worse. The request came coated in sugar, but the demand underneath was iron, and I felt the first ripple of what was coming next. Not a negotiation, not an apology, but a campaign to erase my voice before it could be heard by anyone who mattered. I told her my phone would stay with me, then put it in the pocket of my robe and slid my hand over it like I might a rosary, a talisman against the panic that had begun to scrape the inside of my ribs. They decided to move quickly, because people who live on control understand that speed itself is a weapon. And so in the same breath, my son announced that we would reset the house, meaning I would take a shower, change my clothes, and stop presenting like a victim, while he would call a friend who knew things about guardianship and elder care, and she would run to the pharmacy to pick up my refills, which sounded like concern until I remembered I had no refills due this week. I watched him dial and speak in the language of men who think paperwork makes them right. The clatter of legal-sounding words spilled like dice on a table. Evaluation, capacity, witness, notarize. And I felt the old shame try to climb back up my spine, the shame that tells a black woman to keep quiet, because trouble clings to us like second skin, and authority often looks past us unless we are bleeding. But the sheriff had seen the quilt, and Miss Clarice had held my hand, so I stood a little straighter and made a small plan in the quiet of my own head. The first plan I had made in a long time that did not revolve around scrubbing floors, or rationing money, or keeping the peace. I would gather proof, put it in order, and hold it steady until I could hand it to someone who would take it seriously. Before she left for the pharmacy, my daughter-in-law tried one more pass at sweetness, telling me the bed must have felt too soft for my back, and she would get me a memory foam pad for the floor. Just for a day or two while we rearrange rooms. And I said nothing, because there are times when the words in your mouth are too righteous for the moment you are offered, and if you let them out then, they will be squandered on people who have no intention of listening. Once the front door closed behind her, my son lowered his voice and reminded me of every bill he had paid, and every grocery bag he had carried, and every light bulb he had changed, painting himself as a martyr while standing in a kitchen with my name on the deed, and my hands still smelling faintly of bleach from a lifetime of work. He said the sheriff didn't understand family dynamics, that outsiders always make things messy, that I should have come to him privately rather than performing pain. And with each word, his jaw tightened until the tendons stood out in his neck, and I thought of the little boy who cried when other children called him poor, and the teenager who wanted the expensive sneakers, and the man who learned that saying thank you felt like giving up ground. And I felt grief and fear and fury all at once, braided so tightly I couldn't tell which strand was strongest. When he went upstairs to straighten the room, I slipped into the hallway and took out my phone with hands that still remembered every keypad I had ever scrubbed and every pill chart I had ever kept for patients who trusted me, because I did not lose track, and I began to take photographs with the steadiness of habit. The quilt still creased in the shape of my body, the faint red line on my forearm from the wood, the dent where my pillow had been pressed into the rug, the bed itself with his shoes at the foot and her scarf knotted around the headboard, the empty pill organizer I kept by my nightstand because arthritis is easier when you plan, and the calendar where I had written reminders in a neat, square hand, proof not of confusion, but of a mind that had served others well for decades. I opened the Notes app and typed the time the sheriff arrived, the questions he asked, the exact phrases my son used. I added the name of the neighbor who stood behind him like a sentry. I took pictures of the mailbox stuffed with envelopes addressed to me that I had not opened, because someone always reached them first. I knew from years at the hospital that details are the bones that hold a story upright, that people believe a woman's pain when it arrives dressed in timestamps and dates and edges that don't blur. By the time she came back from the pharmacy with a white bag that rustled with something I hadn't requested, I had tucked my phone deep into the waistband of my skirt and tied my sweater over it like a sash. She set the bag on the counter and announced she had spoken with the pharmacist and taken the liberty of asking for an adjusted dose, because she thought I'd been a bit agitated lately, which would have been almost funny if it weren't so. Dangerous. I told her I manage my own prescriptions and my own body, and I didn't reach for the bag. Her smile slid off her face for a moment, and the woman underneath was all sharp angles and hunger. She mentioned casually that she had driven by the church and heard the building fund was slow and they might need young folks to handle those books more efficiently. A jab so precise I had to grip the counter to keep from swaying, because even my sanctuary she wanted to turn into a ledger she signed. The phone rang then, and my son appeared at the bottom of the stairs, telling me there would be a short visit later that day from a specialist who could assess my needs, which every woman over 55 in this country knows is sometimes code for measuring you for the box they want to put you in, care facility or legal guardianship, both of which look like help on paper and like a locked door in practice if placed over your head without consent. I said nothing and went to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed that used to be mine. And while I sat there, I remembered the factory whistle my husband woke to, the rhythm of our life set by shifts and paydays and summer thunder, and the Sunday smell of hot combs and starch. And I thought about my mother's hands, brown and steady, teaching me how to sew a hem and stretch a roast and hide cash in the binding of a Bible, because sometimes the people closest to you are careless with what they didn't earn. I took the family Bible from the drawer and slid my phone and a little envelope of photographs into the center, where the pages lay thick, a hiding place that had safeguarded other women's contingencies before mine. Then I did something that felt small, but was the spine of all that followed. I called Adult Protective Services myself, not whispering, not apologizing, but speaking clearly into the receiver, giving my name and address and a summary of the last 24 hours that included only what I could prove. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't ask if I was overreacting. I didn't explain why a woman of my age might be so tired that she forgot to smooth her voice for strangers. I simply reported what had happened, and the worker on the other end listened without rushing me and told me someone would come, and that I should keep a record, and that if anyone tried to take my phone or my medications, I should call 911, and that sentence sat like a promise in my ear long after the line went quiet. When I hung up, I texted Miss Clarice and thanked her, then asked if she'd be home later in case I needed a witness, and she answered with a simple, "I'm here," which was more than most people have when the water starts rising. The specialist arrived mid-afternoon in a neat blazer with a clipboard and a tone that sounded motherly, but was not my mother, introducing herself as a care coordinator who partners with families to create safe environments. And in that phrasing was the assumption that my son and his wife were my safety, rather than the flood I was scrambling to outpace. They sat on either side of her as if I were up for parole, nodding eagerly when she used phrases like best practices and burden of care. And I answered every question slowly, not because I didn't know the words, but because I wanted to place them exactly where they belonged, not an inch to the left or right. When she asked if I had fallen recently, I told her I had been placed on the floor against my will last night, and handed her the photographs I had printed from the little wireless machine in my desk that my son forgot I owned, because men like him never imagine the old tools we keep tucked away. When she asked about my medications, I showed her the pharmacy receipt with the date circled and the fact that no refills were due, and then the bag on the counter that contained pills I had not requested. When she asked who helped me manage finances, I unfolded a sheet that listed utilities drafted from my account and the sudden appearance of my son's subscription charges like barnacles clinging to a hull. I watched the care coordinator's eyes shift from gentle to keen, and then to something I recognized from my nursing days: professional alarm. My son tried to interrupt, to speak over me the way he has learned to do when my voice threatens his version of the world. But the coordinator held up a palm and asked him to wait. And he did. Barely. Fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his knee. She took notes. She asked permission to photograph the quilt. She noted the indentation by the couch and the bed upstairs and the empty pill organizer. And at the end, she said there would be a follow-up soon. And, until then, certain safeguards would be recommended. My daughter-in-law asked what exactly those safeguards might be, trying to sound cooperative, and the coordinator said that until the situation was clarified, my access to my room, phone, and medications should be fully respected, that no documents should be signed, that any talk of guardianship must be postponed pending evaluation, and that if there were further conflicts, law enforcement could be re-engaged. She left a card, and when she did, my daughter-in-law's smile returned to her face, but it was tight at the edges like it hurt her to hold it there. Evening came like a lid sliding over a pot, and the house filled with the smells of dinner and the kind of silence that listens for footfalls in the hallway. I cooked my own plate, not because I wanted to share a table with them, but because women who have kept themselves alive on too little for too long learn that feeding the body is both a duty and a declaration. While I ate, my son brought down a folder thick with papers and laid it on the table without meeting my eyes, telling me the tax situation required my signature on a few routine forms and that he had scheduled a notary for the next day so we could put all this unpleasantness behind us. And I felt the heat rise in my cheeks because every word was a mirror of the strategy I had seen men use at the hospital when they wanted an elderly patient to sign away rights, create urgency, insist on routine, bring a neutral third party who will stamp whatever is placed in front of them. I didn't open the folder. I said I would have my own person look at it, and he laughed and asked, since when did I have people? And I said, since I first worked nights and learned the janitor knows where the fuses are, and the cafeteria ladies know who skimps the portions, and The women with the mop buckets know which doctors cheat the clock, which is to say, meaning, my network doesn't look like yours, but it exists, and it is thicker than your contempt. He went to bed early, or pretended to, because the light under their door burned for hours. And while it did, I wrote a list on a yellow pad of the next small things that would add up to a wall. Call the bank in the morning and remove his name as an authorized user on the debit card he swore he never touched. Call the utility companies and set up voice passwords. Move a copy of the deed from the desk to the bottom of the linen closet, because one thing abusers hate is paper you can point to. Bag. Up a few essentials and slide them into the trunk of my car. The title still in my name, because my husband taught me to keep some things separate. Ask Deacon Ruth for a quiet meeting in the church office where the walls have heard every kind of confession and promise to hold them all. Charge a spare flip phone I kept from when my sister still lived and told me not to throw away things that still work. Each task was a stitch, and by the time the house finally sighed into the deep quiet of past midnight, I had pulled enough thread to feel, for the first time in months, like I had something that would hold. Near dawn, when even the birds were still considering their first song, I woke to the creak of the hallway and the whisper of steps meant to be silent. I did not move, but I listened, the way you listen when a fever breaks and you are not sure which way the body will turn. The steps paused by my door and then went past and down the stairs, and a few minutes later the front door opened and closed as gently as if it feared waking the house that fed it. I rose then, pulled on my robe, and went to the landing where I could see the living room, and I stood there long enough for the shapes in the dark to shift toward dawn. And when they did, I saw the quilt was gone, the pillow was gone, the little evidence of my night on the floor erased with the same care my daughter-in-law had wiped the coffee ring from the counter. Because people like them understand that control is part theatre and part clean-up. And if they could not rewrite yesterday, they would at least mop its footprints from the path the sheriff might take if he returned. But I had my photographs, and I had my notes, and I had already placed pieces of the truth where their hands could not reach. And as I turned back to my room, I felt fear and anger, and something like relief that the escalation I had dreaded had finally announced itself, not as a blow, but as a series of quiet edits. And I knew then that the next move would not be theirs alone. Morning came for real, with garbage trucks clattering and the rumble of buses and the gospel station doing its best to lift the city up. And when the phone rang at 9, it was the sheriff again, saying he would be by later to follow up, and that someone from APS might meet him. And I said I would be home and ready. And after I hung up, I stood in the mirror and pressed the comb to the edges of my hair and touched my face with a dab of lipstick, the way my mother taught me before a hard day, not for vanity but for armor. I tucked the Bible with its new hidden cargo into the drawer beside my bed, slid the yellow list into my pocket, and went downstairs to wait for whatever came through my door next, not as a woman bracing for the next indignity, but as a woman who has finally located the center of her own house and intends to hold it. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the kind of light that doesn't invite you out of bed, but instead presses you deeper into your pillow. Yet I forced myself to rise early, to prepare myself for what was coming. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, though inside me there was a storm that had not rested since the sheriff's first visit. My son and his wife spoke in whispers over their coffee, but the tension between us was no longer subtle. It was written in every gesture, in the way they looked at me as though I were already gone, as though the house had shifted owners overnight, and I was nothing but a stubborn tenant clinging to my last corner. But I knew something had changed, because the quilt on the floor, the photographs I had taken, The words I had spoken to the sheriff, they were no longer invisible. They were waiting to be heard again. And today, the sheriff had promised to return. That knowledge filled me with both dread and a strange kind of strength. I dressed with care, not in anything fancy, but in clothes that spoke of dignity, a pressed blouse, my good skirt, the pearls my mother had given me when I was 25. Each button I fastened felt like an act of resistance, a refusal to appear frail or confused. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what this day might bring. I looked in the mirror and forced myself to hold my own gaze. For too long, I had lowered my eyes, let myself become background, let myself shrink so that others could expand into my space. Not today. Today, I needed to stand tall, even if my knees ached and my back cried out in protest. When the knock came, sharp and steady, my son hurried to the door, his voice too quick, too bright, telling the sheriff everything was fine, that we had resolved our little misunderstanding, that neighbours sometimes exaggerate, but the sheriff's expression did not soften. It remained firm, measured, like a man who had seen too much to be distracted by easy words. He asked to come inside, and this time, without hesitation, I stepped forward and said clearly, "Yes, officer, please come in." "There are things you need to see?" My son froze, caught between blocking the doorway and stepping aside, and for one long moment I thought he might actually slam the door shut in the sheriff's face. But something in the sheriff's eyes stopped him, and with a stiff gesture he moved aside. The sheriff entered with a clipboard under his arm, and behind him was a woman from Adult Protective Services, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the calm expression of someone trained to sift through lies. She introduced herself as Miss Granger, her tone polite but brisk, and immediately began asking questions. She asked where I slept, what I ate, how I managed my medications, whether I had access to my finances. My son and his wife jumped in quickly, answering for me, painting me as forgetful, depressed, prone to confusion. But when Miss Granger turned to me directly and asked, "And what do you say?" I drew in a deep breath, pulled my phone from my skirt pocket, and handed her the photographs. Her eyes lingered on each image. The quilt on the floor, the indentation in the rug where my body had lain, the pillow pushed up against the wall, the prescription bag filled with medication I had not requested. She asked if she could keep copies, and I nodded, my throat tightening with both fear and relief. My son's wife let out a small laugh, saying, "She's always been dramatic. You know how older folks like to exaggerate but miss." Granger did not smile. Instead, she jotted down notes, her pen moving quickly, her expression unreadable. The sheriff, meanwhile, walked slowly through the rooms, his eyes sharp. He paused in my bedroom, studying the unmade bed, the shoes at the foot, the scarf tied casually around the headboard. He asked whose items they were, and when my son claimed they were his only temporarily, the sheriff simply nodded, as though filing the lie away for later. The conversation grew heated. My son raised his voice, insisting that they had sacrificed everything to take care of me, that I was ungrateful, that I was trying to ruin their lives with false accusations. His wife added that I had been acting out lately, that perhaps stress or loneliness had made me lash out. I listened quietly until Ms. Granger asked if I had any documents showing who owned the house. Slowly, with deliberate care, I retrieved the family Bible from my drawer, and from between its pages I pulled out the deed, crisp and official, my name clearly printed. I laid it on the table, my hand steady on the paper. "This house is mine," I said softly, but the power in my voice filled the room. "It has always been mine. They live here because I allowed it, not because they have any right to it. For the first time, my son's face faltered, a flicker of panic crossing his features. His wife reached for the deed, but Miss Granger stopped her hand with a quiet firmness that carried more authority than shouting ever could. The sheriff looked at me then, his expression unreadable but heavy with meaning, and I knew that the tide had turned, that something irreversible had happened in that moment. My son muttered under his breath, his words sharp with anger, but no one paid him mind. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Miss Granger asked about my finances, about whether I had access to my accounts, about whether anyone had pressured me to sign documents. I admitted that my son had spoken about guardianship, about paperwork, about notaries. She asked if I had signed anything. I shook my head firmly. "Not yet," I said, "and I won't." She wrote it down. The sheriff then asked me directly, "Do you feel safe in this home?" The question cracked something open inside me. For a long moment I could not answer, because to say no out loud was to admit just how deep the fear had sunk. My eyes burned with unshed tears, but I forced myself to answer. "No," I said finally, "I do not feel safe." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. My son opened his mouth to argue, but the sheriff raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "That's enough," the sheriff said. "We'll be filing a report. Until this is resolved, certain measures will be taken." He didn't specify what those measures were, but the authority in his voice was unshakable. My son's wife tried to protest, claiming this was all an overreaction, that families should handle matters privately. But Ms. Granger's tone was firm. "This is no longer a private matter. This is a case of elder abuse, and it will be treated as such." When they left, the air in the house was electric, vibrating with the kind of tension that precedes an explosion. My son and his wife turned on me the second the door closed, their voices sharp, their eyes blazing. They accused me of betrayal, of airing family business to strangers, of trying to destroy them. But for once, their fury did not make me shrink. I sat at the table, my hands folded over the deed, my gaze steady. I realized then that this was the midpoint of the battle. Not the end, not even the beginning anymore, but the place where everything shifts, where the lies they had built around me began to crumble, where the world outside these walls had finally been invited to see the truth. The rest of that day moved like a blur, filled with raised voices, slammed doors, and threats muttered under breath. But beneath it all ran a current of something I had not felt in years: certainty. The midpoint was not safety, not yet, but it was the turning of the tide, the moment where invisibility ended and exposure began. I knew more storms were coming. I knew they would fight harder now, desperate to regain control. But I also knew I had been seen, believed, and heard. And that was the first step toward reclaiming not just my house, but my dignity, my life, my very self. By the time the sun went down that evening, I had convinced myself the worst of it had passed, that the sheriff's return and Ms. Granger's questions had shifted the ground under their feet enough to slow them, and I moved through my kitchen with a careful, deliberate calm that tasted almost like hope, heating a little stew, putting on the radio low, trying to let ordinary sounds stitch the day back together. I was rinsing a bowl in the sink when the knock came, not tentative this time, but official and heavy, and the sound slid down my spine like a blade. I dried my hands and opened the door to find a uniformed deputy I didn't know, not the steady man from before, and beside him stood a courier in a windbreaker, holding a fat envelope with my name typed across the front in a font that looked like it had been chosen specifically to intimidate. The deputy's voice was formal, almost apologetic, as he confirmed my identity and handed me papers stamped with a court seal, explaining in a steady tone that a judge had signed an emergency temporary guardianship order earlier that afternoon, granting my son authority over my medical decisions and access to my finances in the interest of immediate safety. Pending a full hearing in 2 weeks, the words reached me in slow motion, each one landing with a dull thud, and my mouth went dry as dust as I skimmed the pages, finding phrases I recognized from hospital charts twisted into a new shape: confusion, impaired judgment, non-compliance. All of it anchored to an affidavit signed by my son and a letter from a clinic psychiatrist I had never met. I heard my son's footsteps before I saw his face, because of course he had timed his entrance to the second, opening the hallway door and stepping into the frame with a performance-ready calm, thanking the deputy for doing the right thing and telling me it would all be easier now that he could handle the burdensome decisions, as though I were a child who had begged for relief from the effort of deciding when to pay a bill or how to refill a prescription. Behind him, his wife hovered in a sweater the colour of new money, smiling for the deputy as if she were the one who had called to protect a vulnerable elder from danger. I kept reading and saw a line that made my stomach drop. A notarized acknowledgement of intent, dated last month, allegedly signed by me, stating that I welcomed support with complex finances and wanted my son to step in if my functioning declines. And though my signature had been imitated well, the loops in the R and the pressure on the T were wrong, too heavy, too practiced, and I felt a cold, surgical anger spread through me so cleanly it almost steadied my hands. The deputy asked if I had any immediate concerns, and I heard myself answer in the calm voice I used to use on the ward when a combative family member tried to shout over a discharge plan, telling him I disputed the petition, that APS had visited that morning, that evidence existed contradicting the affidavit, and that I would comply with any lawful order while reserving all my rights to challenge it. He nodded, with a sympathy that didn't change the fact that he was there to serve me, not to save me. And he left me standing in my own doorway with a sheaf of paper that said on its face I was no longer trusted to be the author of my own life. What happened next was studied and swift, because they had prepared for this moment while I had been preparing for the truth, and those are not the same skills. My debit card failed when I tried to purchase stamps online, a little red error that announced the bank had already received the order and flagged my account. My phone buzzed with a text from the pharmacy saying a hold had been placed on my profile, pending verification by the new legal representative. An email pinged from the utility company about authorized contact changes that I had not requested and would not approve. And before I could process it all, a locksmith's van pulled to the curb, with its polite logo and its toolbox thud, the man stepping out and glancing toward my son for instruction. Not me. I told the locksmith he would not touch a single screw in my door without a separate court order concerning real property. And to his credit, he hesitated and asked for clarification, because even people summoned to do bad work sometimes want the comfort of a rule, and my son hissed through his teeth that I was making this harder than it needed to be. I said, without raising my voice, that a temporary guardianship over my person and finances did not rewrite the deed, did not erase the fact that I owned these walls. And the locksmith paled a shade and said he'd better call his office. He sat in his van, making small circles in his notepad, while my son paced in the driveway. And in that odd three-way pause, I slipped to the bedroom, opened the drawer, and pressed my hand flat on the family Bible, not because I needed to hide anything new, but because the cool leather steadied me like a railing when the steps are steeper than you expected. I called Miss Granger on the spare phone I had charged the night before and left a clear message naming the judge, the case number, and the clinic listed on the psychiatrist's letter, asking for immediate follow-up to reconcile the morning's findings with the afternoon's order. Then I called the church and reached Deacon Ruth, whose voice has lifted more tired women than any official could count, and she told me to come by the office or stay put if I felt unsafe, that she would reach legal aid within the hour and find someone who knew how to peel back bad paperwork without tearing the whole fabric. Before I could hang up, my phone flashed with a bank alert warning of attempted transfers flagged for review, and I thanked last night's version of myself for setting new voice passwords and for moving the deed copy to the linen closet and for writing the names of every person I had spoken to on a yellow pad that was now my memory when the stress made holes in the edges of mine. The courier returned once more with a second envelope I had not expected, thinner, but somehow meaner, containing a notice of an ex parte hearing that had already happened that morning, and a line near the bottom that said the court had considered credible reports of self-neglect. I sat down slowly at the table and read that phrase again, hearing how it would sound in a judge's mouth, how it could stretch to include the quilt on the floor if you didn't know who had placed it there, how it could swallow a woman whole if there weren't photographs to anchor the story to its rightful shore. The affidavit included descriptions of me wandering at night and leaving appliances on, both untrue and both plausible enough to stain a record if they went unchallenged for even a week. And somewhere in those lines, I recognized the rhythm of my daughter-in-law's tidy contempt, her habit of wiping rings from counters and footsteps from rugs, removing evidence before truth could attach itself to anything solid. I told myself not to panic, to breathe, and break the day into pieces small enough to hold. Call APS again, call the sheriff's office, and request the deputy's incident number from the morning. Call the clinic to ask how a doctor I had never seen could evaluate me from a distance and stamp me incompetent with language that read like copy pulled from a form. I did each of those things with the patience of a woman who has counted pills for confused patients and documented bruises that bloomed across fragile arms and convinced skeptical sons to listen to nurses who had seen more suffering than they had the vocabulary to name. When I reached the clinic, a receptionist told me the psychiatrist no longer worked there and that all records would need a written request. And as she spoke, I pictured a signature stamp sitting in a drawer and a notary willing to look away for a fee, and my anger found its edge again, clean and righteous. I drafted the request anyway, itemizing the date on the letter and the supposed capacity evaluation, and emailed it from my spare account with a read receipt attached. I followed that with a note to the bank's fraud department, referencing the case number, and asking them to freeze any new beneficiary changes pending judicial review, because the order might open a door, but it did not entitle a thief to ransack the room while the court blinked. Then I took the envelope of photographs from the Bible and slid a copy under the neighbour's door with a short note. For safekeeping. Thank you. Please be ready to speak. Because sometimes protection looks like handing a piece of your life to someone who will hold it flat while the wind tries to lift it away. Late in the afternoon, while the locksmith's van finally pulled away and my son stood on the porch making big, angry phone calls to people whose patience was shorter than his list of demands, Ms. Granger called back, and her voice carried a heat I had not heard earlier, the heat of a professional who has seen a good case muddied by paper that smells wrong. She told me she had already contacted the sheriff's office to log the morning's observations and would be filing an expedited supplement to the court record, attaching her notes, my photographs, and a recommendation that the emergency order be reviewed immediately due to conflicting evidence. She said she could not promise an outcome, only a process. And in that honest sentence, I found more comfort than any false guarantee. She advised me to avoid signing anything, to secure my medications and identification documents, and to prepare a simple timeline for legal aid. When they moved in, when the control escalated, when the quilt hit the floor, when the first knock came. I thanked her and sat with the phone in my lap for a long minute, listening to the house breathe, reminding myself that a setback this sharp did not erase the morning's truth. It obscured it, temporarily, the way a hard rain obscures the road you know by heart. Night drew its curtain early, as if eager to end a day that had already taken too much, and I made tea and wrote the timeline in a slow hand, refusing the temptation to decorate the facts with anger or grief, letting the plainness of what happened do the work of indictment. I added small things because small things often tip scales. A stove knob I photographed in the off position, the receipt from the pharmacy proving no refills were due, the timestamp on the sheriff's first visit, the caseworker's card clipped to the page, the deed photocopy with the corners still gritty from the linen closet. I felt tired in a way that was not just physical, a tiredness that lives in the bones of black women who have had to stand taller than the room allows, who have had to narrate their hurt in a register that power will hear, who have had to keep a record because their memory will be doubted even when it is perfect. I placed the timeline beside the Bible and the photographs and whispered a prayer that did not ask for vengeance, only for clarity and speed, and a judge whose eyes would linger on the right lines. Much later, when the house was quiet and the wind pressed the maple against the window, my son knocked on my door without waiting for an answer, stepping in with that faux patient look that had fooled teachers and supervisors for years. He said this would all be over soon if I stopped resisting, that the hearing would be simple, that I could make this easier on myself by acknowledging I was tired and needed help, that he was only doing what any good son would do. I told him I was indeed tired, tired of being erased, tired of being spoken for, tired of calling what is theft a favor and what is coercion a concern, and I watched his eyes flash because he understood the difference better than he let on. He reminded me of the order, and I reminded him of the deed, and the two truths stood in the room like boxers touching gloves before the bell. When he left, closing the door with exaggerated care, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of the unfair turn settle where it would, feeling it press but not crush, because even as the paper tried to redraw my life, the threads had pulled tight the night before held, and I knew the shape of the next day even if I did not know the verdict. Gather, steady, testify, and make them look, really look, at the woman they tried to fold into a footnote. The next morning began not with the warmth of light through my curtains, but with the thud of footsteps on my porch and the harsh scrape of a car door slamming outside. And I knew before I even opened my eyes that another move had been made against me, because predators never wait. Once they smell weakness, they circle faster, closer, hungrier. And my son and his wife had convinced themselves that yesterday's guardianship order was only the opening act of their drama, not realizing that I had not been broken but sharpened by the injustice. I moved slowly to the door, listening through the wood before turning the knob, and sure enough, there was a pair of strangers in suits, one with a clipboard and one with a briefcase, announcing themselves as evaluators sent by the court to assess the environment. Their words rehearsed, neutral, designed to sound procedural rather than invasive. But their eyes flicked over my furniture and the photos on the walls with a hunger that was anything but neutral. And I knew this was the second. Escalation. The attempt to frame me not just on paper but in space, to build a record of deficiency that would justify everything else they planned to take. I let them in because refusal would be twisted into paranoia, and I walked them through my own home as though I were a guest, pointing out the bathroom, the kitchen, the pantry, answering their mechanical questions with deliberate steadiness, refusing to let my voice betray the fury burning in my chest. And while they wrote in their forms about clutter and safety hazards, I wrote my own record silently in my mind, noting how one lingered too long at the locked cabinet where my documents were stored, how another whispered about possible hoarding, when all he saw was a stack of quilts folded by my mother decades ago. And I reminded myself that truth does not protect itself. It must be defended, documented, spoken aloud at the moment someone tries to erase it. When they left, promising a report by week's end, my son appeared like a shadow on the porch, thanking them with a smile that belonged to a politician more than a child, and he looked at me with that smug tilt of his chin that said, "See, it's all in. Motion now." But I simply closed the door in his face, because there are moments when silence wounds more deeply than words. Inside, I sat at the table and opened my pad, writing the exact time of their arrival and departure, their names, the questions they asked, the words they used. Because every war is fought not only with courage, but with records. And black women of my generation learned long ago that if we do not write down our truth, it will be rewritten against us. I called Miss Granger again, updating her on the unannounced inspection, and she confirmed that such visits were common in guardianship disputes, that my best defense was meticulous documentation, and her voice steadied me because it carried the weight of someone who had guided other women through similar storms. Then I called legal aid, left another message, and sent scanned copies of the forged acknowledgement, along with the photographs of my bruises and the neighbour's written statement that she had heard shouting and seen me pushed from the bed weeks earlier, knowing that the weight of evidence must accumulate like stones until even the most stubborn court cannot ignore it. But the escalation did not pause for my breathing. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call from my bank manager, informing me in a careful tone that my son had appeared in person with the guardianship papers, demanding immediate access to my accounts, and that only the fraud hold I had placed the night before prevented the release of funds. The manager asked if I wished to contest formally, warning that a judge's order could override his caution, and I told him calmly that I would be filing my objection within 48 hours, that he should freeze everything until the court reconciled the conflicting reports. And I thanked him not as a customer, but as a comrade, because in this war, every ally mattered. When I hung up, I felt the weight of what they intended. Not just control, but impoverishment, the deliberate stripping of my independence so I would have no strength to fight. And I remembered my grandmother's stories of landlords who raised rents to drive black families from their homes, of employers who withheld wages until desperation forced submission, and I understood that this was the same violence in new clothing, the violence of control disguised as concern. By evening, the sheriff returned, this time with a different energy, less confident, almost reluctant, carrying a wellness check request that my son had filed, claiming I was refusing food and medication, and though the deputy's eyes betrayed doubt, he still had to perform his duty, asking to see my pantry, my pill bottles, my refrigerator, I obliged with a steady hand, showing the stocked shelves, the labelled pillbox, the receipt from the pharmacy, and I watched him nod slowly, his pen moving across his pad with a clarity that gave me hope. Before leaving, he said softly, "Ma'am, make sure you have someone with you tomorrow for the hearing, because they're pushing hard." And those words, though spare, reminded me that even inside the system there are cracks where truth can shine through. That night, I could not sleep, not only from fear, but from the clarity of strategy. I spread my papers across the table like a general with maps, the photographs, the receipts, the forged document, the incident numbers from the sheriff, the APS case notes. I practiced my testimony aloud, not in anger, but in measured detail, because I knew the courtroom would not reward rage, it would reward precision. And I promised myself that I would not let them twist my story into the caricature of a confused elder. I prayed softly, not for victory, but for endurance, for the strength to carry the story to its end without faltering, because this was bigger than me. It was about every woman of my generation who had been silenced by children grown arrogant on our labor. Every grandmother erased by courts that preferred tidy lies to messy truths. And when I finally lay down, the house creaking softly around me, I understood that escalation was not the end, but the necessary pressure that forces the truth into the open. And I promised myself that no matter how deep they tried to bury me under paper, under lies, under shame, I would rise with my records, my witnesses, my voice, and I would make them face what they had done in the full light of day. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. And for a moment, as I stood outside Department 3 with my folder pressed to my chest, I felt all the years on my body at once. The long miles of double shifts and church basements and PTA, meetings and funerals, everything that had taught me to stand still when the world tried to push me around. And I told myself that if I could hold my ground through those seasons, I could hold it here too, beneath the fluorescent lights and the seal. On the wall and the gaze of a judge who didn't know me yet, my son arrived with his wife flanking him like a second shadow. A sleek attorney in a blue suit at his elbow, already flipping to the right tab in a binder, and the sight of their polish and preparation tried to make me small. But then the sheriff stepped off the elevator with Miss Granger at his side and Miss Clarice behind them wearing her Sunday hat like armor. And I breathed again because I was not alone, because the story I carried had witnesses, and the truth had papers with dates and signatures that belonged to me, and not to the lie that had been built in my name. When the clerk called our case number and we filed in, the room felt colder than the hall, as if justice requires a different air to do its work. And the judge looked over his half-moons at the stack on his bench with the distance of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. The attorney for my son began with a practiced rise, voice pitched in that reasonable register designed to soothe and guide, reminding the court that an emergency order had already been issued based on serious concerns, that this was merely a continuation to ensure stability for a vulnerable elder. And at the word elder, I felt my jaw tighten. Not because I reject the number of my years, but because I reject the way they tried to weaponize them. He handed up the forged acknowledgement, the psychiatrist's letter, and then, with a flourish much too pleased with itself, the evaluator's morning notes about clutter and hazards. And as the judge read, my son kept his face arranged in sorrow, glancing at me with a softness he has never used when the door is shut, and I felt the strange calm of someone who knows the other half of the room has not yet been heard. Miss Granger stood next, no theatre in her posture, just a woman with a satchel and a careful chronology, and she told the court that she had visited the home, that she had observed no evidence of self-neglect, that she had photographed a quilt and a rug, indentation and an empty pill case that did not match the narrative of confusion, but rather the narrative of displacement, and she asked to submit her report into the record with attachments including my photographs and the neighbour's statement. The judge took the folder, eyebrows lifting almost imperceptibly when he saw the timestamps and the clarity of the images, and my son's attorney objected in that smooth way that does not expect to win but hopes to bruise, muttering about foundation and relevance. But the judge overruled him and kept reading, and the rhythm in the room shifted by a fraction, the way a boat shifts when a weight moves to true centre. The sheriff gave measured testimony, not dramatic, simply exact, noting the first visit where he had been called to the house for elder mistreatment, describing what he saw and what he did not see, the way the quilt lay near the couch, the way my son and his wife spoke over me, the way Miss Granger had asked to see the bedroom, and found men's shoes at the foot of the bed and a scarf tied like a claim around the headboard. And when the attorney tried to elicit from him a concession that families disagree and the law should not interfere, he answered with a sentence so quiet it silenced even the people sitting in the back. The law interferes when harm puts on the mask of care. Miss Clarice spoke next, and I wanted to weep at the dignity of her voice, the way she did not embellish, but simply told the court that she lives across the driveway and heard me being pushed out of my room weeks ago, that she saw me the next morning, moving like a woman whose bones had slept on wood, that she watched my son laugh through the kitchen window while I struggled to lift a trash bag with both hands. And when asked why she hadn't intervened earlier, she looked straight at the bench and said she had been raised to mind her business until the day came when minding your business became complicity, and that day had come. My turn came not with fanfare, but with the judge tipping his head, inviting me to the stand, and I walked there on aching knees with my folder under my arm and my mother's pearls at my throat, and I swore to tell the truth with a voice that did not tremble because I had practiced it to steadiness in the dark. I told the story the way a nurse charts a wound, in sequence, with measurements and dates, noting the colour of the bruise when it first appears and how it spreads by morning, documenting what was said and who said it, attaching the photographs to the words so they could not be peeled apart. I did not speak about my son's childhood or my sacrifices or my grief, because I knew this room did not have space for the memories that make a mother foolish with hope. I spoke about the night I was dragged from my bed and the morning I was found on the floor, about the forged signature where my R does not loop like that, about the psychiatrist who had never met me, about the guardianship order entered ex parte while an APS worker was still walking through my kitchen counting pill bottles. The attorney tried to interrupt, to redirect, to paint me as combative, but the judge held up a palm and asked him to sit, and in the hush that followed, I finished my timeline and set the folder down on the rail like an offering laid at an altar. Then came the cross, those careful questions that try to turn a woman's clarity into confusion, and I answered each one with the patience I used with frightened patients who insisted they had not taken their pills even as I watched them swallow, because I understood that this was not about how I felt, but about whether my facts would hold. When the attorney pressed me about the evaluator's notes claiming clutter, I told him those quilts belonged to women who survived a century of erasure, and I would not throw them away to make room for a prettier lie. And a small murmur rippled in the gallery that the judge quieted with a glance, though I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, because sometimes even the bench recognizes the poetry inside the plain fact. When he suggested I must be paranoid to lock my documents in a cabinet, I reminded him that a temporary order over my person does not mean I must lay my deed like a doormat. And when he finally asked if I didn't want help, if I wasn't tired, if I didn't long for relief, I said I wanted the kind of help that leaves a woman whole, and not the kind that cuts her into pieces small enough to manage. The judge leaned back then and removed his glasses, and the silence in that small courtroom sounded to me like the space between a storm's last thunder and the first bird daring to sing. He asked my son to stand and answer 3 simple questions. Had he ever spent the night in my bedroom in the last month? Had he or his wife ever moved my bedding to the floor? And had he procured a mental health letter from a clinician who had not personally examined me? My son's answers came wrapped in excuses, but the core was unmistakable. He admitted to sleeping in my bed temporarily during renovations, denied moving my quilt, but could not explain the indentation photographs, and claimed the clinic had agreed to the letter based on family reports, which the judge repeated slowly as if tasting a bitter herb. The attorney scrambled to soften it, arguing family urgency, but the air had changed again, and in that quiet I felt the first faint exhale of a truth finally being allowed to breathe. The ruling did not arrive with gavel banging, only with a voice that took on a new firmness as the judge recited his findings: that the emergency guardianship had been granted on an incomplete and misleading record, that substantial and credible evidence now contradicted key assertions made in the affidavit, that the process had been used not to protect but to control, and therefore the temporary order was dissolved effective immediately, with notice to the bank and the pharmacy and any other institution that had relied on it. He ordered that no documents purporting to grant authority over my person or estate be presented by my son or his wife without a full hearing on the merits, and that any attempt to alter locks, utilities, or accounts without my written consent would be treated as contempt. Then, as if he had been saving the last stone for a precise throw, he turned to the sheriff and requested that his office conduct a welfare check that very afternoon to ensure I had unfettered access to my room, my phone, my medications, and my papers, and to remove any party whose presence posed ongoing risk or intimidation pending further review. The attorney began to object, but the judge's hand rose, the order was signed, and the bailiff's eyebrows lifted, and in that small upward flick I saw the acknowledgement of a tide turning. Outside the courtroom, my son snarled that I had humiliated him, that strangers would now whisper about us at the hardware store, that I had brought shame onto a family that already carried more than its share, and I almost laughed from the strange relief of no longer feeling required to receive his poison as truth, because for the first time the shame slid off me and landed where it belonged. Ms. Granger squeezed my hand and walked me down the steps, promising to email the minute the formal notice went out, and the sheriff said he would see me shortly at the house and to leave the chain on until I heard his voice. Miss Clarice tucked my arm into hers for half a block, and we stood together on the sidewalk while the wind fussed with the edges of our coats like a fidgety child. And we did not say much, because when the moment is this big, sometimes words are small. I reached home just as the patrol car eased to the curb, the afternoon sun turning the badge on the door into a flash of light, and the deputy, who had seemed reluctant yesterday, now moved with a quiet certainty that made the house look different, as if the angles had shifted slightly back toward square. My son was already on the porch, red-faced and tight-lipped, and his wife hovered with that chirpy smile she uses on clerks and assistants. But the deputy did not look at either of them until he had stepped inside and verified that I was steady, that My phone and pills and papers were where I said they were. And then he read the judge's order aloud, in a voice that carried to the sidewalk, even to the neighbour who pretended to check his mail but lingered to hear, and my son's mouth twisted like metal under strain. The deputy opened my bedroom door with a flat palm and stood aside as I stepped over the threshold, touching the edge of the quilt that had been folded and hidden and reappeared like a gospel refrain. And he nodded once, then turned to the hallway and said they would need to gather their things and leave for 72 hours while the matter was reviewed for criminal referral. And if they resisted, he would call for a second unit, and they could explain their objections to a judge from a different room entirely. They sputtered and pleaded and performed surprise, but the performance had lost its lighting and the audience had gone home. And what remained was the simple fact of a woman re-entering her own room while the law held the door. I did not gloat, because gloating steals energy from the work of reconstruction. I simply sat on the edge of my bed and pressed my hand to the mattress, felt the give that remembered my shape, and let the sounds of bags being filled and drawers being slammed wash over me like a storm moving down the block. When the door finally closed behind them, and the deputy confirmed the locks would remain untouched, and the neighbour across the street lifted his hand in a silent salute, I lay back and stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling that had stared at me when I was on the floor, and I whispered a thank you that was not to any person, but to the stubborn thread in me that had not broken when they tugged. The house was mine again, in a way that felt both ordinary and holy. The way tap water tastes sweeter after a boil notice is lifted. The way shoes feel good once the pebble is gone. And I knew that there would be more hearings and more papers and more work. That justice does not end with a signed order, but with a pattern of days in which a woman sleeps where she belongs and breathes without asking permission. And yet I also knew that this was the turning point I had prayed for, the moment when private humiliation became public truth, when the machinery that had been used to crush me had been forced to lift. And I sat up and smoothed the quilt my mother had sewn, felt the seams she stitched by lamplight, and promised her and myself that I would keep those seams from unravelling if it took every steady breath I had left. The night after the judge's order, I sat on my bed staring at the quilt my mother sewed, running my fingers across the stitches as if each thread was whispering that I had made it through the storm. The house sounded different without my son's footsteps or his wife's sharp voice echoing in the hall. And though the silence carried loneliness, it also carried safety, a kind of peace I had not felt in months. The sheriff had left after checking every room, reminding me that his office would patrol past my street more often, and for the first time in a long time, I believed that someone with a badge actually meant to protect me. I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat with a cup of tea, letting the steam wash over my tired face. And I thought about every black woman I knew who had been told to be silent, to accept what family or society or law handed her, and I felt a duty, heavier than anger, but lighter than fear, to tell it all, so that no one could twist my story again. The next days passed with a rhythm of small victories. I went to the bank myself, unaccompanied, and the manager shook my hand firmly as he confirmed that my accounts were safe, my signature restored as the only authority. At the pharmacy, the clerk who had known me for years smiled wide when I explained the guardianship was dissolved, and she pressed an extra coupon into my hand, whispering that she had worried for me. The neighbour across the driveway knocked one evening with a plate of cornbread and simply said, "We're proud of you." And though the words were plain, they filled my kitchen with a warmth brighter than the overhead light. Each gesture reminded me that while my own child had betrayed me, community could still rise up around me, stitching a new kind of family from compassion and respect. I could not escape the ache of what had been broken. Sometimes at night I would remember my son's laughter as a boy, the way he once curled against me after a nightmare, and grief would pierce me sharper than rage ever did. But then I remembered his smirk in the courtroom, his forged papers, the cold way he denied pushing me from my bed, and I let the grief burn clean, turning into resolve. I promised myself that my story would not end in bitterness, but in testimony, because I knew the system only changes when women like me drag our pain into daylight and refuse to let it be buried again. I began writing everything down in longer form, not just the incident reports, but the feelings, the humiliations, the prayers I had whispered on the floor. I sent copies to Miss Granger, who encouraged me to consider joining a support group she ran for older women facing financial and domestic abuse, and I agreed, understanding now that strength is not in standing alone, but in standing together. When the day of the follow-up hearing arrived, I was ready. My son did not appear. His attorney withdrew, citing irreconcilable differences, and the judge closed the case with a final word that the petition for guardianship had been not only unfounded, but abusive in itself. I walked out of that courthouse lighter, my shoulders no longer bowed. On the steps, I found a small circle of women waiting, neighbours, church members, even Clarice with her Sunday hat again, and they clapped softly, not as though I had won a war, but as though I had survived one, which in truth is the greater victory. We stood there together in the autumn sun, and for the first time I allowed myself to laugh, not because the pain was gone, but because I had carried it and still found breath. Back at home, I moved my things back into my bedroom, placing the quilt neatly, arranging my photographs on the nightstand, reclaiming the small sanctuary that had been stolen. I planted geraniums by the porch, so the first thing anyone saw approaching my house would be colour and life, not fear. I made new keys and handed one to Clarice, another to Ms. Granger, not because I expected trouble, but because I wanted the locks on my door to symbolize trust freely given rather than control stolen. Each evening I turned on the radio, let the gospel station fill the house, and I sang quietly to myself, relearning the sound of my own joy. The reckoning with my son will never be easy. Blood does not stop being blood, even when poisoned by greed. But I no longer live under his shadow, and I no longer measure my worth by his approval. I live in my home, in my body, in my truth. And when I see the sheriff's car roll by, when I hear the laughter of children down the block, when I kneel by my bed to whisper thanks, I know that the ending of this chapter is not silence or defeat, but survival carrying itself forward. I am a black woman of 62 years. I have been dragged from my bed and left on the floor, but I rose, I fought, and I won the right to rest again in dignity. And that, above all, is the story I will leave behind.